Welcome to Giving an Answer, the show dedicated to defending the historic Christian faith. I am your host, A.C. Felder. The topic today is a response to moral relativism. And to talk with me about this, I have a special guest, Steven Garofalo. Let me tell you about Steven. Steven has a bachelor's of arts in criminal justice from the University of Maryland. We both are alum of the University of Maryland. I graduated with a computer science degree. When did you graduate?
Criminal justice and government and politics.
When did you graduate?
When? 1988.
Okay. Yeah, that's a little bit before my time. Okay. Master of Arts in Apologetics from Southern Evangelical Seminary. Now, we were contemporaries there. Speaker, author, and teacher on issues relating to Christian apologetics. He's author of Right for You, But Wrong for Me, A Moral Response to Relativism. And that is actually what we're going to be talking about today. I'm actually getting my questions from this book, and it's a great book that deals with moral relativism. I commend you. Excellent book.
Thank you, Harold.
Founder of National Apologetics Training Center located in Charlotte, North Carolina. Welcome to the show.
Harold, thank you for having me back again. My word, I was on one of your first shows, 2004?
It's been about 10 years. I never had any idea when I did that show that I would still be doing it. I was a lot thinner, a lot darker. I mean, I don't even know if I don't think I had glasses back then, but time catches up with all of us, so especially me.
I'm toe-to-toe with you on all three of those areas.
Okay, all right. So tell us a little bit about the National Apologetics Training Center.
Hey, Harold, thanks. The National Apologetics Training Center is a group of 5 Christian apologists, all with their master's levels degree in Christian apologetics or divinity, or master's in religion. And we have Dr. Bridges, who has his PhD in philosophy, and he also has a couple of masters as well. But we come together to train churches, to equip parachurch organizations, to speak to college campuses and high schools, and really to help equip a new generation to be able to not only defend their faith and to shore up their faith, but also to advance the faith in what I consider to be kind of a hostile environment against Christianity and our culture.
You're absolutely right. Very hostile. So let's get on to it. All right. So the topic is a response to moral relativism. The first thing I want to know is, what is morality?
It's an excellent question. Morality deals with what is right and what is wrong. And so morality is really kissing cousins to ethics. Ethics and morality are both what we call descriptive. So they're descriptive from the sense that morals or morality and ethics tell us what we ought to do. Truth tells us what we do. In other words, we ought not kill, we ought not steal. Truth, true and false, comes from the perspective that, did you kill somebody?
Right.
You know, that's descriptive, not prescriptive. And so it deals with what is right and what is wrong. And you can equate that back to 2 areas. And one is, there's two distinct roads on what is morality. It either derives from God, which is unmovable and unchanging, or it comes from man, which is changing and morphing with people's different views, desires, and what they really want.
That's why this is going to be such a great topic. So now that we know what morality is, what is moral relativism?
Yeah, moral relativism comes in 2 basic forms, but moral relativism at its core says, basically, it's a philosophy that believes that morality is not attached to any objective central point, in other words, from God. It can only, moral absolutes must come from an moral absolute maker. So moral relativism denies that objective standpoint, and it takes a standpoint that, or the perspective philosophically, that all morality is relative, and it's going to come, each person can define morality for their own, or each culture, which is a second form, can do the same. In other words, so it comes in right for you, but not for me, is the individual or the group. You also have subjective cultural subjectivism, which says that different cultures then can define what's morally right according to their cultural norms or their cultural, their cultural differences from one country to the other.
Now, one of the things you talk about in your book is you give a brief history of moral relativism. Could you give us a brief history?
Yeah, it started, really, if you go back to biblical times, is the oldest record we have, with Adam and Eve with the serpent. And the serpent says simply, if you eat of, if you eat from this tree, you are going to die. And in a nutshell, it was a half-truth, and a half-truth is a lie. So by mucking the truth, it's not like they were going to fall over and die instantly. They would eventually die physically, but they would die immediately spiritually. So that's where it started. If you take it then philosophically, if you move up about 1,500 years to roughly 450 BC, and you find two ancient characters. One is Herodotus. He's the father of history. He was the first official historian. He started writing history officially from a polytheistic perspective, and what he did by doing that is polytheism is the belief in many gods. And by doing that, he kind of introduced a plurality of morality. And then
you have to break that down a little bit.
Yeah, in terms of if you believe many gods exist and not a central theistic God, then you automatically opening the door to the existence of many different moral codes or different moralities according to whatever each God wants.
Okay.
So that's the most complex. Let's move on to Protagoras. Protagoras was another ancient philosopher. He was a sophist, actually.
Explain what a sophist is.
A sophist is, he was almost like an ancient sage who sat and trained up university students and the wealthy to influence society. And he was the first sophist, and he coined the term, man is the measure of all things. And by doing that, he introduced the concept, at least officially introduced it, that man, not God, is the central point or the standard for all things moral. And then if you then take that up to, we'll fast forward it from the ancient to contemporary philosophy, you go up to David Hume, who came on the scene, I guess, 1711, and he passed in 1776. But he is the philosopher who has had the most influence on modern day skepticism. And basically what he said, his main point was that objectivity cannot be known apart from experientialism. In other words, we can't know anything objectively unless we attach it somewhere with experience or sensory experience, one of your five senses. But that fails because there's a good example, I think, is that, okay, you come into my house or I come into your house and Tina makes a wonderful meal, and I come in and I go, boy, Harold, that smells great. I love that apple pie. And as I walk back towards the lavatory, I see that there is no apple pie, but there is an apple pie air freshener in the bathroom. There's a big difference between that.
Right.
It's not that you didn't smell apple pie, but your sensory perception misled you. There was no apple pie there.
Right. Good point. Good point. So, that brings us up to the modern time. So, but how does this view then, moral relativism, how does that compare to what the Bible teaches? Yeah,
and let me connect that last thought. As soon as you bring up skepticism based on your sensory perception, then you begin to correlate that to the existence of God and Scripture and moral absolutes. But what does the Bible say? The Bible's pretty clear on moral absolutes. I think the best example of moral absolutes can be seen in the Ten Commandments. They're not the 10 suggestions. They're pretty clear. They're pretty clear in the sense that they are, thou shalt not do a lot of things, or thou shalt do a lot of things. We shall not murder, and we shall not steal, covet our neighbor's wife, that type of thing. They're not suggestions. It's pretty clear and pretty black and white. And there's a lot of examples elsewhere in the Bible. If you go to Romans chapter 12, God calls us to hate what is evil and to cling to what is good. And you can find that throughout the Bible, and you can find that in Isaiah. But think about it. The Bible actually tells us to hate something and then to cling to the opposite. There's not really a whole lot of gray in there. It's pretty black and white. There's absolute truth as to what we ought to cling to and what we ought to be repulsed by, or what we ought to reject and hate.
Now, how do we know that absolute right and wrong do exist? I mean, you're saying that they do. You're saying that the Bible says that they exist, but how can we be sure?
Yeah, Romans chapter 2, the Apostle Paul's writing here, and he says, to the Jews, they have the written law, We know that we have the Ten Commandments, and then they had all the Jewish laws. So they had God's law, and they had the Ten Commandments. They basically had the law written in stone. But then he goes on to say, to the Jews they had the written law, but to the Gentiles they are a law unto themselves. And what he's saying there, he's speaking to the moral law, or nature's law. In other words, all human beings, all cultures, it doesn't matter where in the world, at all times, live by a certain code of moral laws, and we can't escape them. We all live by them. We don't need to be taught them. We all know it's wrong to go beat up the lady down the street. We all know it's wrong to murder somebody. We may not care in some cases emotionally, and we may separate that. Like if you look at a serial killer, right? They leave these messages. They always leave little cards. They have their MO, as the police or the FBI say, their modus operandi. They know in their mind that it's wrong, but emotionally they just don't care. So it drives them crazy in their head because they know, all human beings know that 2 + 2 = 4. And morally, they know what they're doing is wrong. And I think that's one of the main reasons why they leave calling cards and why they taunt the police with phone calls. I mean, if you really wanted to get away with being a serial killer, why would you call the police and taunt them? Why would you leave little notes?
No, I hear people say a lot of times, that, well, people steal all the time. There are people who are kleptomaniacs. Mm-hmm. So then, how do you respond to someone who says that someone can have an actual medical condition to where they just steal?
Yeah, I think that there are some people who have a medical condition where they cannot know better. But I think in those cases, there's very, very few. In other words, they really have to be out of their mind, like really out of their mind. Not most cases where people claim insanity in the prison. That's not what I'm talking about. I mean, people who are severely mentally incapacitated. But for the most part, that doesn't pertain to 99.9% of the population. But I'll say this, if you ask the young man who did all the murder in Sandy Hook, you see, if you're going to if you want to buy moral relativism, you have to then, people will say he had a mental condition, right? Remember, they diagnosed him with some kind of mental condition. And people said, well, here, this is part of it. But at the end of the day, if you asked him, was it right for you? I could bet you if you could raise him from the dead, he would say, yeah, it was right for me. It may not be right for you. He may even say it's just not right, but it's still right for me.
Right.
You see, just because someone thinks it's right for them doesn't make it's right according to God.
I hear a lot of talk about the difference, I hear a lot of talk about values. And it seems like values is sometimes spoken of in replacement of morals. What's the difference between morals and values?
Well, morals are based on morality is a prescriptive. It's a prescription given by an ultimate prescriptor, being God. So while you have God morality. And by the way, people can come up with all kinds of moralities, by the way. I'll be honest with you, different cultures do have their morality. It doesn't mean it's the right morality or that it's true or that it's right. It just means they make up their own morality. But when you talk about values, families have family values. And inasmuch as those values fall in line with Scripture and God's prescription and His Word and His principles, they're right. But they differ from the sense that a family could have their own set of values or a culture can have its own set of values. But those values are actually usually simply a group of beliefs about what is right or wrong by a small group like a family or by a culture. But values are very different. They're different than morality. You could have values aren't necessarily right or wrong as well, I should say, from the perspective that we can say we value Christmas or we value Valentine's Day. Those are values in our culture. Another culture may not value Christmas or may not value Valentine's Day. They have those are just beliefs or things that they find important. But I would say values are as well attached to things like things that are attributed to what people prize in a given culture or a given family. But if they're not attached to God's ultimate morality, then there's, and they don't necessarily need to be, then they're not right.
Why does it matter whether we are moral relativist or not?
Yeah, I think that two things. I think first of all human beings are absolutists. They're all moral absolutists.
Then why do we always hear about moral relativism?
Well, let me continue on there.
Okay.
I should say we're not all moral absolutists, but we're all absolutists. In other words, when you go to your bank and you go to withdraw money, or you go to your doctor, you want the absolute truth. Okay, now that's truth. That's descriptive. It's not prescriptive as morality is. But nobody really likes to be beaten and to be burned, and no one likes to be raped or pillaged or stolen from. And so it's just philosophically people will disagree with moral absolutes for one simple reason. And why is it important? They'll disagree with moral absolutes because it gets in the way of their freedom. Most notably, their moral freedom. But even within that, within morality, it's sexual freedom. I would say that's the biggest thing that people want. They want, if they can get away from moral absolutes, then they can have freedom, they can have sex freedom, they can have all kinds of freedom. But why is it important? Well, it's important because if you get away from any kind of moral standard of what's absolute, society begins to unravel. So as you know, you get disease, you get STDs, and there's certain like AIDS. AIDS could be eradicated probably within one generation if you just change the behavior of homosexuality. And that's just one example. Teenagers could stop what's now I think it's 1 in 4 teenagers, high school kids, has an incurable sexual STD.
Wow. I had no idea it was that high.
And they can stop that by just stopping that behavior. Right. And then you could put that money towards curing cancer, which people get without asking for it.
Right. Good point. So I'm going to go through some of the objections that people always bring up against an absolute moral standard. Here's one, probably the most popular one. Morality is the product of evolution that ensures the survival of the race. Basically, evolution has bred in us to be nice to one another so that the species can survive. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, I think that there's no evidence behind that theory, but it's an interesting concept. But I would say that morality is tied to an ultimate standard. So if it's evolutionary or it's subjective to some kind of evolution, then it's constantly changing. Then you would need to be able to prove that at some point in history that certain moral behavior is acceptable. So has murder ever been acceptable as just a normal thing in society in the history of the world, or stealing to be acceptable just as, hey, it's fine, go ahead and steal my stuff? I don't think so. I have never read anything that says that that's been the case. And so I think that that instead of saying that something is evolutionary, means it's changing, if you base it on God and Scripture, by God's very essence, He's unchanging. And I would say that's the truth. The truth is that morality, objective morality, is tied to God, and God's essence is unchanging, and He cannot lie, and He's all perfect, and He's all good. And so I would say that you have those two schools. You have God and you have man. And I can show you through proof that when society lives according to God's morals, moral absolutes, that society performs pretty well. And when it degradates and it falls into some kind of evolutionary process, the way our culture, especially in America, is going right now, things become unraveled. I mean, you can't go outside your door without worrying about your kids being abducted, or, sexual crimes and just general crimes, immoral, crimes in general.
Here's another one. You probably touched on it, or you have touched on it already, but maybe we can go in a little bit more depth. It is our society, or society in general, that determines what is right and what is wrong.
Yeah, that goes to the second form of moral relativism, which is cultural subjectivism. And that's where you speak to each culture. A lot of people like to believe that each culture defines what's morally right for that culture. But let me give you an example here. When the planes hit the towers in 9/11, there was people, I remember reading on the news, who said, it's a terrible thing, but it's their culture. That's their culture. You know, I mean, if you want to go to heaven in Islam, the only way that you're guaranteed to know that you're going is martyrdom. And so, you know, but the question is that raises a bigger question, is it ever right to look at another culture's morality and criticize it? And I think that's true. I think that's right. In as much as you have atrocities like that going on, you have to be able to look at that. And the same can be true of atheism. If you look at Hitler or Stalin, their religion was clearly atheism. So we need to be able to look at that and criticize that and see, you know, and be able to critique that. But, you know, it's not true that each culture can say what's right. Because again, if each culture determines what's right, well, each culture is run by a government. And each government has a head of government. Well, then you're back to man is the measure of all things. And we've discussed that.
I remember having a conversation with an atheist I worked with at NASA. And I remember asking him that, you know, who determines right and wrong? And he said the government does. And I said, well, you don't believe that. And he said, what do you mean? I believe that. I said, no. I said, on your lawn right now is a sign that says we should get out of Iraq. Stop the war in Iraq. That's the government. The government is the one who's sending us to war in Iraq. And if the government decided right and wrong, then how can you criticize the government? Because they set the standard.
Yep.
Slavery would still be okay if the government was the standard. If people didn't go against the government saying, you know what, it's wrong. Nothing would ever change. There would still be slavery. There would still be all types of atrocities or all types of inhumane laws because people could not rise up against the government because the government would be the standard.
Yeah, the government didn't free slaves, and in the United States, Christians were really behind that. The church was.
Right. Here's another one. Because there are exceptions to right and wrong, there must not be a standard. An example. It is morally right for the person to lie who's hiding a Jew from the Nazi. So because lying is okay in that circumstance, then right and wrong must be situational.
Yeah, and that's one of the main three objections to moral relativism. And I would say that, you know, in that case, remember, morality and ethics are both prescriptive. They're kissing cousins. They're pretty much almost the same thing, actually. So what happens is, in this case, we lean towards the greater good. In other words, Nazis knock on your door, you have a Jew in the house. You know that if they find out there's a Jew in the house, they're going to kill the Jew. So what you do is you lie to them, and you say, there's no Jew in here. No Anne Frank. We don't have anybody here. And so you've then lied. But the question is, you have to say then, you have to weigh the sin of lying against the sin of murder. So is telling a lie to a Nazi murderer just as weighty, or is it weightier than handing them over to be slaughtered unjustly, to be murdered? And so murder is a weightier sin ethically speaking, and I think scripturally speaking. You know, they're both just as much a sin, but one is a weightier sin. So morally speaking, I think you have the moral obligation to protect the Jewish person, in this case, Anne Frank. It's better to tell a lie. I don't believe God's going to hold you accountable to two bad situations. Let me point out another quick example. I read a story of a man who was, for whatever reason, on a boat, and his boat capsized in England, and he said he had to make a decision. Right there was the worst decision he ever had to make in his life. Does he save his son, or does he save his daughter? He had to make that decision. Right. One is going to live, one he knows is going to die. So what do you do? Is there a right or wrong decision in there?
Right. You know? See your point. Well, here's another one, and I hear this one, especially when elections come up. No one should force their morality on anyone else. For example, I may believe abortion is wrong, but I don't have a right to tell anyone else that it's wrong.
Well, first of all, this is not my morality, your morality, it's our morality, just as much as 2 + 2 = 4 for all of us. I mean, God gave us this morality to protect all of us from one another as well as ourselves. But let me give you this idea. The liberals are very good, actually, at giving that message. You know, don't force your morality or your morals on us or on me. But I would say, hold on a second, really, you're forcing your morality on me or on us. I mean, if you look at television, you cannot find really almost any television show without sexual, according to the Bible, without sexual immorality all through it. I mean, you can't even watch the HGTV consistently without having, either people that are cohabitating and it looks exciting, or same-sex marriage, or that type of couples without that. And so in that case, I'm trying to watch a television show, and I don't have any other choice if I want to watch that television show than to have that forced down my throat. So, they're forcing their morality down my throat. So the question is, if you want to be free, is don't stifle one group or the other. But I would say that the Christian ethic is being subdued unrighteously in this country. It's freedom of speech is being squelched, and we're not allowed to voice our side.
You just reminded me of something about watching TV. I remember I was watching a TV show one time. I don't know if I think it was CSI. I can't remember exactly what it was. And just, out of the blue, these two men just started kissing. And I was like, oh, I didn't sign up for that. I didn't sign up for that. But they didn't ask me.
Yeah.
They didn't ask me whether or not I found that objectionable, or if it offended me, or whether or not I had a right to be offended. They pushed it on me. It's only Christians, for some reason, who are not allowed to do the pushing, but everyone else can do the pushing.
Yeah.
We're just supposed to sit back and take it, but not supposed to react at all. Yeah. Well, Steven, believe it or not, we've actually come to the end of the show. So I want to thank you for being on my show. Special guest, Steven Garofalo. We were talking about the topic of the show again. If I can get this thing, here we go. There we go. A response to moral relativism. And that will end this episode of Giving an Answer. Be sure to join me again next time. And until then, goodbye and God bless.
Good go, man.
You can find out more about Giving an Answer, as well as listen to other episodes by visiting us online at www.givingansanswer.org.